When a racist driver kicks out a little black girl on a deserted road, he has no idea that his actions will have shocking consequences. What happens next will make you take a fresh look at the concept of justice and fortitude. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and be sure to leave a comment. Where are you watching this from? The sun rose quietly over the modest neighborhood, its warm golden rays spilling through the thin curtains of the White family's small but welcoming home. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as the faint hum of the city waking up created a gentle backdrop for the day ahead. Inside the kitchen, Amelia White moved with a calm precision, her tailored blouse crisp and her short curls neatly styled. She exuded a sense of authority, but her soft smile hinted at a deep love for her family, especially her 12-year-old daughter Melanie. Melanie sat at the kitchen table, poking at her bowl of cereal, the spoon clinking against the porcelain in a slow, rhythmical motion. Her thoughts were distant, clouded by a mix of anxiety and dread about the school day ahead. Amelia noticed the lack of appetite and placed a firm but gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You need your strength, sweetheart. Big things happen when you're ready to take them on," Amelia said, her tone encouraging but firm. Melanie looked up at her mother, her wide brown eyes filled with uncertainty. She didn't answer immediately, instead stirring her cereal until it formed a bland, soggy mess. "Mom," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "do you ever feel like everything you do just makes it harder for people to like us?" And Amelia froze for a moment, the question catching her off guard. She crouched beside Melanie, meeting her eye level. "What do you mean, honey?" Melanie sighed. "It's just being the mayor's daughter. People don't like you because you're changing things. They think you're taking things away from them, and they think I'm different." Amelia's eyes softened. She had always known her role as the city's first black mayor would come with challenges, but it hurt to see the weight of her position affecting her daughter. "Melanie, people resist change because it scares them, but change is what helps us grow. I need you to remember that when they see someone brave enough to do what's right, it makes them uncomfortable, but it's worth it." Melanie tried to muster a smile, but couldn't quite manage it. I just don't want to be the reason people act like that." Amelia stood and placed a kiss on her daughter's forehead. "You're not the reason. You're part of the solution, and that's something to be proud of." The sound of the school bus rumbling down the street interrupted their conversation. Melanie grabbed her backpack reluctantly, her shoulders slumping under the weight of both the bag and her worries. Amelia watched her leave with a mix of pride and unease. She wanted to shield Melanie from the harsh realities of the world, but she also knew her daughter was stronger than she gave herself credit for. As Melanie walked to the curb, the bus screeched to a halt and its doors hissed open. The driver, Jack Hunter, sat hunched over the wheel, his face weathered and his expression hard. His graying beard was unkempt, and his uniform looked like it hadn't seen a proper wash in weeks. He barely glanced at Melanie as she stepped on board, his only acknowledgement a grunt that sounded more like irritation than greeting. Melanie kept her head down as she moved through the narrow aisle. The bus was filled with the chatter and laughter of other kids, but the moment she walked past, the volume seemed to dip slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence that only made her feel more isolated. She slid into an empty seat near the middle, clutching her backpack tightly against her chest. Jack's eyes briefly flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Melanie. A sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he said nothing. He revved the engine and pulled the bus back onto the road with a jerk that made everyone sway in their seats. Melanie stared out the window, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to settle in the pit of her stomach every time she rode with Jack. The ride was uneventful at first, the bus rattling along the uneven streets. Melanie tried to focus on the passing scenery, tuning out the voices around her. But Jack's voice soon cut through the background noise, sharp and mocking. "Looks like royalty graced us with her presence again," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few kids stifled giggles, while others looked away, not wanting to be involved. Melanie's cheeks burned, but she didn't respond. She learned that silence was often the best defense against people like Jack. Still, the sting of his words settled heavily on her heart. As the bus continued, Jack's jabs grew bolder. "Bet it must be nice having a mom who tells everyone else what to do. Maybe she should tell you how to sit still and keep quiet." Melanie gripped the straps of her backpack tighter, her knuckles turning white. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, but tears pricked the corners of her eyes. When the bus finally reached the school, Melanie was one of the first to get off. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she hurried into the building. Her heart was pounding, her face still flushed with embarrassment and anger. She didn't look back at Jack, but she could feel his eyes on her, a lingering reminder of the powerlessness she felt. Inside the school, Melanie tried to shake off the morning's events, but the tension clung to her like a shadow. She spent most of the day quietly navigating her classes, avoiding unnecessary attention. By the time the final bell rang, she felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the school day was over, and dread at the thought of getting back on the bus. The afternoon ride home was no better. Jack's attitude remained hostile, his comments cutting and his disdain palpable. Melanie sank into her seat, counting the minutes until she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the bus. When they reached her stop, she bolted out the door without a backward glance, her legs carrying her as quickly as they could toward the safety of home. Amelia was waiting for her at the door, a warm smile on her face. "How was your day?" Melanie hesitated, her mind flashing back to Jack's sneering face and the laughter of her classmates. "It was fine," she lied, forcing a weak smile. Amelia studied her daughter's face, but decided not to press. Instead, she opened her arms, and Melanie stepped into her embrace, finding a brief moment of solace in her mother's strength. As the evening settled in, the weight of the day lingered in Melanie's mind. She didn't know how much longer she could endure the unspoken hostility, but for now, she found comfort in the steady presence of her mother. Little did she know, the events of tomorrow would test her resilience in ways she could never have imagined. The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds as Melanie stood at the curb, clutching her backpack with both hands. The air felt heavier today, as though the world itself knew something was about to go wrong. She tried to steady her breathing, focusing on the rhythm of the approaching bus. Its familiar groan echoed down the quiet street, a metallic reminder of the uneasy truce she faced each day on her ride to school. The bus screeched to a halt in front of her, and the doors hissed open, revealing Jack Hunter's ever-sour expression. His tired eyes flicked toward her with something that resembled disdain more than acknowledgement. He didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, his hands gripped the steering wheel as he waited impatiently for her to climb aboard. Melanie stepped onto the bus, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the worn rubber flooring. The atmosphere inside was as stifling as ever. Children were scattered across the seats, their chatter momentarily softening as they noticed her. Melanie didn't look up, focusing instead on finding her usual spot halfway down the aisle. She slid into the seat nearest the window. her small frame sinking into the worn fabric. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, hoping the bus ride would be uneventful. Jack glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his lip curling slightly. He revved the engine with unnecessary force, and the bus lurched forward, jolting Melanie against the seat. She gritted her teeth, gripping the edge of the seat for balance as the bus settled into its usual rattling pace. The first few minutes were calm, the murmurs of conversation filling the air. Melanie stared out at the passing streets, her thoughts drifting to the day ahead. But the illusion of peace shattered when Jack's voice broke through the noise. "Looks like our little Miss Royalty is gracing us with her presence again," he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. Though his words were quiet enough to seem casual, they carried across the bus, drawing the attention of the other students. Melanie felt the familiar burn of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. She focused harder on the window, pretending not to hear him. The bus grew quieter, the usual chatter dimming as curious eyes darted toward her. A few students exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Jack didn't stop. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, clearly enjoying the way Melanie's shoulders tensed. Must be nice, having a mom who thinks she's in charge of everything. Bet she's teaching you how to boss people around, huh? A faint snicker came from the back of the bus. Melanie's grip on her backpack tightened until her knuckles turned white. She kept her gaze locked on the window, refusing to give Jack the satisfaction of a reaction. The bus continued its rattling journey, the atmosphere thick with tension. Jack's jabs grew bolder, his tone more pointed. "Bet you think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" he sneered. "Well, newsflash, kid. Out here, you're just another passenger, no special treatment." Melanie's heart pounded in her chest, each word cutting deeper than the last. She fought back the tears that threatened to spill. Knowing they would only make things worse, she tried to remind herself of her mother's words, that strength came from standing tall in the face of adversity. But in this moment, strength felt like an impossible luxury. The bus turned onto a stretch of quiet road, the city's bustling streets giving way to empty fields and dense woods. The chatter had faded into uneasy silence, the other students sensing the shift in Jack's demeanor. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening as he guided the bus toward the side of the road. With a sudden jolt, the bus came to an abrupt stop. The force of it threw Melanie forward slightly, her backpack sliding off her lap. Confused murmurs rippled through the bus as students looked around, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Jack turned in his seat, his eyes locking on to Melanie. The smirk on his face was gone, replaced by something colder, more menacing. "You," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Out." Melanie's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered, barely audible. "I said out," Jack repeated, his voice rising. "You think you're too good for this bus? Fine, you can walk the rest of the way." A few students gasped. Others exchanged uneasy looks, unsure if this was some cruel joke or a serious command. Melanie's heart raced as she looked around for help, but no one spoke up. The weight of their silence crushed her. "You can't do that," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "I can do whatever I damn well please," Jack snapped. "Now get off my bus." For a moment, Melanie stayed frozen in her seat, her body refusing to move. Jack's glare hardened, and he leaned over the steering wheel, his posture radiating hostility. "You think I'm playing around? Get off!" The words hit her like a slap. Slowly, Melanie stood, her legs feeling like lead as she made her way toward the front of the bus. She could feel the stares of her classmates boring into her back, a mix of pity and fear in their eyes. She kept her head down, her hands clutching her backpack as though it were a lifeline. As she reached the door, Jack leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Maybe this'll teach you and your mama to stay in your lane." The doors hissed open, and Melanie stepped onto the dusty shoulder of the road. The heat of the sun bore down on her as the bus doors slammed shut behind her. She stood there stunned as the bus roared back onto the road, its engine rumbling like a beast retreating into the distance. The sound of the bus faded, leaving only the quiet rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of birds. Melanie looked around, realizing just how isolated she was. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by tall grass and dense woods. There was no sign of another vehicle, no indication of how far she was from home or safety. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the straps of her backpack, the reality of her situation sinking in. She was alone, miles from home, with no one to help her. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Crying wouldn't get her anywhere. She had to move. Taking a deep breath, Melanie began walking. The road stretched ahead like an unforgiving path, and every step felt heavier than the last. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a faint reminder of the strength she was supposed to have. She didn't feel strong. She felt small, scared, and painfully alone. But she kept walking, one step at a time. The sun was relentless as Melanie walked down the deserted road, her feet dragging against the uneven asphalt. The weight of her backpack pulled on her shoulders, making every step feel like a test of endurance. Around her, the vast expanse of countryside stretched endlessly. Fields of tall grass swayed in the wind, and clusters of dense trees loomed like silent sentinels. The sound of her sneakers scuffing the ground was the only noise in the oppressive quiet. Her initial anger at Jack had begun to dissipate, replaced by a gnawing sense of fear. What if she didn't find her way home? What if no one came by to help? She glanced behind her, half hoping to see the familiar yellow bus returning. But the road was empty. A lump formed in her throat as she tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack. She couldn't afford to cry. Not here, not now. She pressed on, trying to focus on the rhythm of her steps. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat began to trickle down the sides of her face. Her throat felt dry, and she realized with a pang of regret that she hadn't brought a water bottle. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and sweat across her skin. Memories of the morning flashed through her mind, each one a sharp reminder of how unfairly she'd been treated. Jack's mocking words echoed in her head, and she felt her chest tighten with anger and humiliation. She thought of her classmates, their eyes averted, their silence deafening. No one had stood up for her. No one had even tried. Tied to pretty girls in the valley, Morin and Nun tried. Dangerous. A gust of wind rustled the tall grass beside her, and Melanie jumped, her pulse quickening. She glanced nervously toward the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. She'd heard stories about wild animals in the area, coyotes, stray dogs. Her imagination began to spiral, conjuring images of glowing eyes and sharp teeth. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. There was nothing out there. She was just scaring herself. The road stretched on, a ribbon of gray cutting through the landscape. Melanie's legs ached, and her pace slowed as the heat sapped her energy. She stopped for a moment, crouching on the side of the road to catch her breath. The grass brushed against her arms, its dry texture prickling her skin. She tried to remember the last time she had seen a car pass by on this road. It had been hours, maybe more. The isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight. As she sat there, she thought of her mother. Amelia, white, strong, fearless, determined. Her mother would know what to do. She always did. Melanie pictured her sitting in her office, surrounded by stacks of papers, her phone buzzing with calls. Despite the chaos, she always had time for Melanie, always made her feel important. The memory brought a faint smile to her face, but it quickly faded when she realized that she had more calls to get to. Her mother didn't know where she was, and Melanie had no way to contact her. The thought made her chest tighten, and for a moment she felt the familiar sting of tears. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. Her mother wouldn't cry in a situation like this. Her mother would keep moving, no matter what. The sound of a distant engine broke through her thoughts, and Melanie's head snapped up. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she turned toward the noise. A beat-up pickup truck appeared on the horizon. Its dull red paint faded from years of use. Melanie hesitated, uncertainty and hope battling in her mind. She stepped closer to the road, raising one hand tentatively. As the truck approached, it slowed down, and Melanie's pulse quickened. The driver was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He leaned out the window, his face lined with years of hard living. "You lost, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Melanie nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She cleared it and managed to croak, "I need to get home." The man studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Where's home?" She hesitated. Her mother had always told her to be cautious around strangers, but what choice did she have? "In town," she said finally, "about 5 miles from here." The man scratched his chin, glancing at the empty road behind her. "You've been walking this whole time?" Melanie nodded again, and the man let out a low whistle. "Well, hop in. Ain't right for a kid to be out here alone." She hesitated, glancing at the truck's rusted exterior and the pile of tools and rags in the passenger's seat. Something about the man seemed rough, but not threatening. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind urged caution. "I'm okay," she said quickly. "I'll keep walking." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself, but it's a long way, and it's only gonna get hotter." She shifted gears and the truck rumbled forward, leaving Melanie standing in its wake. She watched it disappear down the road, a pang of regret tugging at her. Maybe she should have taken the ride. But the thought of being trapped in a stranger's vehicle made her stomach churn. As the truck disappeared over the horizon, Melanie turned back toward the road. Her legs felt heavier with each step, and the sun seemed even harsher now. The fields on either side of her began to blur together, their golden hues merging into a sea of sameness. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her steps, counting them in her head to keep herself moving. Her thoughts drifted to her mother again, and this time a memory surfaced. A warm summer evening when she was 8 years old. They'd gone to a park on the edge of town, and Amelia had taught her how to ride a bike. Melanie had fallen at least a dozen times, scraping her knees and elbows, but her mother had been patient, encouraging her to get back up every time. "Strength isn't about never falling," Amelia had said as she wiped the dirt from Melanie's hands. "It's about getting up no matter how many times you fall." The memory brought a small smile to Melanie's face, and she straightened her shoulders, pushing through the fatigue. She would get home. She had to. The road ahead curved slightly, and as she rounded the bend, she spotted something in the distance. A small, weathered shack nestled at the edge of the trees. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling and its roof sagging. But the sight of it gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe there was water, or at least some shade where she could rest. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she approached the shack. As she drew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He wore tattered clothes and held a walking stick in one hand. Melanie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man noticed her and raised a hand in a cautious wave. "Don't be scared," he called, his voice rough but not threatening. "Just passing through." Melanie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the man stayed where he was, his posture relaxed. "You look like you've been walking a long time," he said. "You need water." Her throat burned with thirst, and the offer was tempting. She took a tentative step closer, her eyes never leaving the man. "You have water?" He nodded, reaching into a small pack slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a battered plastic bottle and held it out to her. "Here, take it." Melanie approached slowly, her heart pounding. She took the bottle and twisted off the cap, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. The man watched her with a faint smile, his eyes kind but tired. "Long road ahead," he said. "You be careful out here." Melanie nodded, clutching the bottle tightly. "Thank you," she murmured. The man tipped his hat, then turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Melanie alone once more. She stared after him for a moment before turning back to the road. Her legs still ached, and her body felt heavy, but the water had revived her spirit. She squared her shoulders and kept walking, the memory of her mother's voice urging her forward. The road home was long, but Melanie was determined to reach it, one step at a time. The house was quiet when Melanie finally arrived, her legs trembling and her feet dragging as she climbed the front steps. The familiar porch light glowed softly against the fading evening sky, a beacon of safety after the long and grueling journey. She fumbled with the latch on the screen door, her fingers shaky and slick with sweat. Inside, the smell of home, a faint mix of lavender and fresh laundry, enveloped her. For a brief moment, the exhaustion and fear that had plagued her all afternoon melted away. Melanie dropped her backpack by the door and leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. Amelia's voice floated from the kitchen, calm and melodic as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I look over the final draft tonight. We'll need to discuss the zoning issue before the end of the week." Melanie didn't want to interrupt. She tiptoed toward the stairs, hoping to make it to her room unnoticed. But Amelia's keen ears caught the faint creak of a floorboard. She turned the corner, her phone tucked between her ear and shoulder, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Melanie. "You're home late," Amelia said, a note of concern creeping into her voice. She placed her hand over the receiver. "What happened?" Melanie froze, caught in the crosshairs of her mother's attention. Her mind scrambled for an excuse, but the events of the day weighed heavily on her, making it impossible to lie convincingly. "It's nothing," she mumbled. "I just walked part of the way." Amelia frowned, her eyes narrowing as she took in her daughter's disheveled appearance. Melanie's hair was matted to her forehead, her shirt wrinkled and stained with dirt. Amelia ended her call abruptly, setting the phone down on the counter with a decisive click. "Walked? Why would you do that?" Amelia crossed the room, her voice firm but tinged with worry. "And why didn't you call me? You look exhausted, Melanie." "I'm fine," Melanie said quickly, avoiding her mother's gaze. "It's not a big deal." Amelia reached out, gently tilting Melanie's chin up so their eyes met. "Sweetheart, you're not fine. Tell me what's going on." Melanie hesitated, her throat tightening as she fought back the tears threatening to spill. The memory of Jack's sneering face, the laughter of the other kids, the isolation she'd felt on the road. All of it came rushing back, overwhelming her. "Ah!" She shook her head, stepping back out of her mother's reach. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered. Amelia studied her daughter carefully, her brows knitting together in concern. She knew that pushing too hard would only make Melanie retreat further. Taking a deep breath, she softened her tone. "Okay, but promise me you'll tell me when you're ready." Melanie nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She shuffled toward the stairs, each step feeling like a monumental effort. By the time she reached her room, her limbs felt like lead. She collapsed onto her bed without even bothering to change out of her dirty clothes. Her body ached and her mind raced with everything that had happened, but exhaustion soon pulled her into a restless sleep. Amelia stayed in the kitchen, her thoughts churning as she replayed the brief exchange with Melanie. Something was wrong. Something much bigger than her daughter was letting on. Amelia poured herself a cup of tea, the warm steam rising as she leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the darkened yard. She thought about Melanie's reluctance to ride the bus lately, her hesitance to talk about school, the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever the topic of her classmates came up. As much as Amelia wanted to respect her daughter's boundaries, her instincts as a mother told her that this couldn't wait. The memory of her own childhood flickered in her mind. Growing up in the South as a young black girl, she'd faced her share of discrimination and cruelty. She knew what it felt like to be singled out, to carry the burden of other people's prejudice. The thought of Melanie experiencing anything similar made her stomach turn. Amelia set her tea down and walked toward her office, where stacks of papers and folders cluttered the desk. She sifted through the pile until she found the one she was looking for, a report on public transportation and safety regulations. Her recent reforms had ruffled feathers in the community, particularly among the school bus drivers, who claimed the changes were unnecessary and burdensome. Amelia had dismissed their complaints at the time, confident in her decisions. But now she wondered if there was more to their resistance than she'd realized. Pulling out her phone, she made a note to contact the school principal first thing in the morning. If something was happening on those buses, she needed to know about it. And if someone was targeting Melanie because of her position, they would regret it. The next morning, Melanie woke to the smell of breakfast wafting up from the kitchen. Her muscles protested as she rolled out of bed, her legs still sore from the previous day's trek. She shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, before heading downstairs. Amelia was waiting for her at the table, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. She smiled warmly as Melanie entered, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "Morning," Amelia said, gesturing for Melanie to sit. "I made your favorite." Melanie slid into her seat, her appetite barely registering. She poked at the eggs with her fork, avoiding her mother's gaze. Amelia didn't press immediately. She sipped her coffee, giving Melanie a moment to settle. But as the silence stretched on, she couldn't hold back any longer. "I need to know, Melanie. Why did you walk home yesterday?" Melanie stiffened, her fork clattering against the plate. "I told you, it's nothing." "It's not nothing," Amelia said gently but firmly. "You came home exhausted, covered in dirt, and you didn't want to talk about it. That's not normal, sweetheart." Melanie's eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I just didn't want to be on the bus, okay?" I didn't want to be around him." "Oh," Amelia's voice sharpened, her body tensing. "Who are you talking about?" The driver," Melanie said finally, her voice trembling. "Jack, he doesn't like me. He says things, and yesterday he made me get off the bus. He just stopped in the middle of nowhere and told me to leave." Amelia's face darkened, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. "He what?" Melanie flinched at the anger in her mother's voice. "It's fine. I'm fine. I made it home." "No, it's not fine," Amelia said, her tone fierce. "No one has the right to treat you like that. I don't care who they are." Melanie shrank into her chair, the weight of her mother's intensity making her feel small. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it." Amelia softened, reaching across the table to take Melanie's hand. "It is a big deal, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again." Melanie looked down at their joined hands, her mother's warmth grounding her in the moment. She nodded reluctantly, a small spark of relief flickering in her chest. For the first time since yesterday, she felt like she wasn't carrying the burden alone. As Amelia stood, determination etched into her features, Melanie couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Her mother had always been a fighter, and now she was ready to fight for her. The school's administrative building loomed large in the morning light, its austere brick exterior a stark contrast to the soft autumn hues of the trees surrounding it. Amelia strode through the front doors, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. Her expression was calm but determined, a practiced mask honed through years of navigating political battles. Inside, though, she felt a simmering rage. The thought of someone abusing their position to harm her daughter filled her with a quiet fury. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, clearly accustomed to dealing with the town's mayor. "Good morning, Mrs. White. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I need to speak with Principal Edwards immediately," Amelia said, her tone leaving little room for negotiation. The receptionist nodded and gestured toward a small waiting area. "I'll let him know you're here." Amelia sat briefly, her eyes scanning the hallway as students passed by in clusters. Their laughter and chatter felt at odds with the storm brewing in her chest. After a few minutes, the principal appeared, a tall, balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly harried expression. He extended a hand in greeting. "Mayor White, to what do I owe this visit?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. Doc Amelia shook his hand firmly. "Principal Edwards, we need to discuss the conduct of one of your employees. It's a matter of my daughter's safety." The principal's face shifted subtly, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "Of course. Please, step into my office." They walked into a modestly furnished room lined with bookshelves and decorated with framed certificates. Amelia took a seat across from Edwards, folding her hands neatly in her lap as he settled into his chair. "Now," he began, leaning forward slightly, "what seems to be the issue?" Amelia's voice was steady, though her eyes burned with intensity. "My daughter, Melanie, came home yesterday after walking several miles from a deserted stretch of road. She was forced off the school bus by the driver, Jack Hunter." Principal Edwards blinked, visibly startled. "Forced off the bus? That's a serious accusation?" "It's not an accusation," Amelia said firmly. "It's a fact. My daughter told me what happened, and she was too afraid to speak up before. This man humiliated her in front of her peers, endangered her by abandoning her miles from home, and has a history of making discriminatory remarks." The principal's expression darkened as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. "I wasn't aware of any issues with Mr. Hunter." He's been with the district for years, but if what you're saying is true, this is unacceptable." "It is," Amelia said, "and it's not just about my daughter. If he feels entitled to treat one student this way, who's to say he won't do it again? Or worse?" Edwards nodded, his demeanor turning more serious. "I'll launch a formal investigation immediately. We have protocols for handling complaints against staff, and this will be taken very seriously." Amelia arched an eyebrow. "With all due respect, protocols aren't enough. My daughter's safety was jeopardized, and I won't sit back while the process drags on. I want to meet with him." The principal hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. "Mrs. White, I understand your frustration, but direct confrontation may not be the best." "It's not a confrontation," Amelia interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's accountability. If he's confident in his actions, he should have no problem facing the consequences." Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. Very well. I'll call Mr. Hunter in. Please understand, though, that this will be handled professionally and in accordance with district policy." Amelia nodded, her expression unchanging. "That's all I ask." The tension in the small conference room was palpable as Amelia sat at one end of the table, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. Jack Hunter entered with an air of casual indifference, his uniform slightly wrinkled and his hat tucked under one arm. He glanced around the room, his eyes narrowing briefly when they met Amelia's. Principal Edwards followed close behind, carrying a folder of documents. He gestured for Jack to take a seat opposite Amelia, then sat at the head of the table. "Mr. Hunter," Edwards began, his tone measured, "thank you for coming in on such short notice. We're here to address a serious concern raised by Mayor White regarding your conduct as a bus driver." Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "What kind of concern?" Amelia didn't wait for Edwards to speak. She fixed Jack with a steady gaze, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Yesterday, you forced my daughter off the bus on a deserted road. You humiliated her in front of her peers and left her to walk miles home alone. Care to explain?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he managed a smirk. "I didn't force anyone off the bus. She chose to leave. I told her to behave, and she didn't like being called out." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe that a 12-year-old girl voluntarily got off a moving bus in the middle of nowhere?" Jack shrugged, his smirk fading. "Kids these days don't like authority. Maybe she thought she could get sympathy from Mommy Dearest by making a big deal out of nothing." Amelia's fists clenched under the table, but she kept her voice level. "This isn't about authority, Mr. Hunter. This is about your blatant abuse of power and your ongoing hostility toward my daughter." Edwards interjected, his voice strained. "Mr. Hunter, these are serious allegations. Do you deny making derogatory comments toward Melanie or any other students?" Jack's eyes darted toward the principal, his expression hardening. I might have said some things. Kids are soft these days, always looking for someone to blame, but I didn't do anything wrong." Amelia leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp and deliberate. "You endangered my child. You left her alone on a road where anything could have happened. That's not just wrong, it's reprehensible." Jack's face flushed with anger. "You think you can come in here and throw your weight around because you're the mayor? Maybe you should worry less about buses and more about running this town." The room fell silent. Edward shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly struggling to maintain control of the meeting. Amelia, however, remained calm, her piercing gaze never leaving Jack. "I am running this town," she said quietly. And that includes ensuring that every child, mine included, is treated with dignity and respect. If you can't handle that responsibility, you have no business driving a school bus." Edwards cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Mr. Hunter, until this investigation is complete, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately." Jack's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. "Fine," he snapped, "but this isn't over." He stormed out of the room, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Amelia exhaled slowly, her composure intact despite the tension in the air. Edwards looked at her with a mix of respect and exhaustion. "I'll make sure the investigation is thorough," he said, "and I'll follow up with you once we have a resolution." "Thank you," Amelia said, standing and gathering her things. "But let me be clear. If the resolution doesn't ensure the safety of every student on that bus, I will take this to the school board and the press." Edward nodded, clearly understanding the weight of her words. "Understood." As Amelia left the building, the crisp morning air felt sharper against her skin. She had taken the first step in holding Jack accountable. But she knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. Not for Melanie, and not for the other children who might have suffered in silence. Amelia tightened her grip on her bag and squared her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting as a mayor. She was fighting as a mother, and she wasn't about to lose. The first ripples of the incident began spreading through the town by the next morning. Small whispers turned into full-blown conversations as word of Jack Hunter's suspension reached parents, teachers, and community members. By noon, local social media pages were ablaze with discussions. Posts speculated about what had happened, some blaming Jack for overstepping his authority, while others accused Amelia White of using her position to push her personal agenda. Melanie was unaware of the growing storm as she sat quietly at her desk in homeroom. The whispers of her classmates barely registered as she focused on the doodles in her notebook. She tried to shrink into her seat, hoping the day would pass without incident, but her unease only grew as she noticed the sidelong glances and hushed conversations around her. "Did you hear?" one boy muttered to his friend. "Hunter got suspended. Heard it had something to do with the mayor's kid." "I bet she complained to her mom," another chimed in, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always running to mommy." Melanie's chest tightened, her pencil still in mid-doodle. She tried to ignore the rising heat in her cheeks and the lump forming in her throat. They didn't know what had really happened. They didn't know how it had felt to be left alone on that road, scared and vulnerable. But their words still stung. At lunch, Melanie sat at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the bustling crowd. Her sandwich sat untouched as she stared at the swirling patterns on the tabletop. She wanted to disappear, to blend into the background until all the attention shifted away from her. But she couldn't escape the weight of the stares, the lingering whispers that followed her wherever she went. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Amelia was holding her own against the tide of public scrutiny. A press conference had been hastily organized in response to the uproar, with local journalists and concerned citizens packing the room. Amelia stood at the podium, her expression calm but resolute as she faced the sea of cameras and microphones. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here today to address the situation involving a school bus driver and my daughter, Melanie White. First, let me say that my actions as mayor have always been guided by the principles of fairness, justice, and the well-being of every member of our community, especially our children." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Yesterday, I learned that my daughter was subjected to inappropriate and dangerous treatment by an individual entrusted with the safety of our students. As a mother, I was horrified. As a mayor, I was compelled to act. This is not a matter of favoritism or personal vendetta. It is a matter of accountability and ensuring that no child in our community is ever made to feel unsafe. A reporter raised his hand, his voice cutting through the room. Mayor White, some residents feel that this suspension was an overreaction. They believe Jack Hunter has been unfairly targeted. What do you say to them? Amelia met his gaze with unwavering confidence. I understand that change can be uncomfortable, but let me ask those residents this. If it were their child, their son or daughter who had been left on the side of a deserted road, would they still call this an overreaction? The safety of our children is not negotiable. Another reporter jumped in. There are claims that this incident is being used to push your broader agenda on transportation reform. How do you respond to that? Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line before she responded. My transportation reforms are about improving efficiency, safety, and fairness across our system. They are unrelated to the specific incident, which is a clear example of one individual abusing their authority. I will not apologize for holding people accountable. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a mix of approval and skepticism. Amelia let them simmer for a moment before continuing. I want to make this clear. This is not just about my daughter. It's about creating a community where every child feels protected, and every parent can trust the people responsible for their care. That is my responsibility as mayor, and I will not shy away from it. The conference ended with mixed reactions. Some praised Amelia's conviction while others accused her of overstepping her bounds. The divide within the community deepened, with factions forming on both sides of the debate. That evening, Melanie sat in the living room, watching the news coverage of her mother's press conference. Amelia joined her, settling onto the couch and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "How are you holding up?" Amelia asked softly. Melanie shrugged, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I don't know. Everyone's talking about it. About me. It's like I can't escape it." Amelia squeezed her shoulder gently. "I know it's hard, sweetheart, but sometimes standing up for what's right means being in the spotlight, even when it's uncomfortable." "I didn't want this," Melanie whispered, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to be invisible." Amelia sighed, pulling her daughter into a gentle embrace. "I know, and I'm so sorry you had to go through this, but your story is important. It's making people think, even if it's hard for them to admit it." Melanie hesitated, her thoughts churning. "Do you think they'll believe me?" "Not everyone will," Amelia admitted, "but the truth doesn't depend on whether people believe it. What matters is that you know your worth and you don't let anyone take that away from you." Melanie nodded slowly, her mother's words settling over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of strength, a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. The following morning, a rally was held outside City Hall, organized by local activists and concerned parents who supported Amelia's call for accountability. Melanie hesitated to attend, nervous about being in the spotlight, but Amelia encouraged her. "It's your story, Melanie," she said. "Your voice matters." The rally was a mix of speeches, signs, and passionate conversations. Melanie stood quietly by her mother's side, her heart pounding as she watched the crowd gather. When Amelia introduced her to speak, Melanie's stomach twisted with anxiety. She stepped forward hesitantly, gripping the microphone with trembling hands. "Hi," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Melanie." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. She took a deep breath, her mother's reassuring presence anchoring her. "I didn't ask for any of this," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "I didn't want to be the center of attention. But what happened to me wasn't okay, and it's not just about me. It's about every kid who's ever felt scared or helpless because someone in power didn't treat them the way they should." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. A few people clapped, their support giving her the courage to keep going. "My mom always says that standing up for what's right isn't easy, but I think she's right. It's scary and it hurts, but it's important. So, thank you for listening and for believing that things can get better." The applause was thunderous, the crowd erupting in cheers as Melanie stepped back, her cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and relief. Amelia pulled her into a hug, whispering, "You were amazing." For the first time in what felt like forever, Melanie felt a sense of peace. Her voice had been heard and her story had made a difference. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time she believed it could lead to something better. The city's division was more pronounced than ever. The aftermath of Melanie's speech at the rally had sent shockwaves through the community. Supporters praised her bravery, seeing her as a symbol of resilience and justice. Detractors, however, accused Amelia of exploiting her position and turning a personal grievance into a public spectacle. The air in the town was thick with tension, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. Amelia, as always, faced the scrutiny head-on. In the days following the rally, she worked tirelessly to push forward new safety measures for school transportation. These measures included mandatory cameras on buses, stricter hiring protocols for drivers, and enhanced training on diversity and professionalism. Each of these proposals faced resistance, but Amelia was undeterred. At the same time, Principal Edwards completed the school's internal investigation into Jack Hunter's conduct. The findings were damning. Multiple students had come forward anonymously, recounting similar incidents of mistreatment and verbal abuse. Jack's behavior was no longer an isolated event. It was part of a troubling pattern. When the school board convened to discuss the findings, Amelia attended the meeting as both a mayor and a concerned parent. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with a mix of parents, teachers, and community members packing the seats. Jack Hunter was present as well, sitting stiffly at the end of the room with his union representative. The board chair, a stern woman with salt and pepper hair, called the meeting to order. "We're here today to discuss the findings of the investigation into Mr. Hunter's conduct and to determine the appropriate course of action. Mayor White, you've requested to speak. You have the floor." Amelia rose, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Chairwoman Davis. I appreciate the opportunity to address this board, not just as the mayor of this town, but as a mother whose child was directly impacted by Mr. Hunter's actions." She paused, scanning the room. "The findings of this investigation confirm what I already knew, that Mr. Hunter abused his position and endangered the safety of the students under his care. My daughter was forced off a bus left miles from home on a deserted road because of his prejudices and lack of professionalism. But she was not the only one. Other children have come forward, and their stories paint a clear picture of a man unfit for his role." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. Amelia continued, her voice steady. This is not about revenge. This is about accountability. We entrust our children to the care of this school district every day, and we have a right to expect that they will be treated with respect and dignity. Mr. Hunter violated that trust, and there must be consequences. When she finished, the room erupted into murmurs. Some parents nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Jack's union representative rose next, defending his client with arguments about his years of service and the alleged misunderstanding of his actions. The debate raged on for nearly an hour, with tensions running high on both sides. In the end, the board voted unanimously to terminate Jack Hunter's employment. The decision was met with mixed reactions, applause from some parents, angry mutters from others. Jack stormed out of the room without a word, his face red with fury. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Amelia's safety reforms were implemented across the school district, despite vocal opposition from certain factions of the community. The installation of cameras on school buses became a symbol of progress for some and a point of contention for others. But Amelia remained steadfast, knowing that the measures would protect children and hold drivers accountable. Melanie, too, found herself adjusting to a new reality. The attention from the rally gradually faded, and life at school began to return to normal. Though some students still whispered behind her back, others approached her with words of support. One afternoon, as she walked to her locker, a girl from her math class stopped her. "Hey, Melanie," she said shyly. "I just wanted to say, what you did at the rally was really brave. I don't think I could have done that." Melanie blinked in surprise. "Oh, thanks." The girl smiled. "If you ever want to sit with us at lunch, you're welcome to." Melanie felt a small spark of warmth in her chest. "Thanks. I might take you up on that." The encounter was brief, but it left Melanie feeling lighter. Slowly but surely, she began to find her place again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the town in hues of gold and orange, Amelia and Melanie sat together on the front porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Amelia sipped her tea, her gaze distant, as she reflected on the past few weeks. "You've been quiet," she said, glancing at Melanie. "How are you feeling?" Melanie shrugged, fiddling with the hem of her sweatshirt. "Better, I guess. It's just a lot." Amelia nodded. "It has been. But you've handled it with so much strength, Melanie. I hope you know how proud I am of you." Melanie looked up at her mother, a small smile playing at her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars began to appear in the night sky. The world felt quieter now, the chaos of recent events finally settling. Though the road had been difficult, they both knew they had come out stronger on the other side. Amelia reached over, taking Melanie's hand in hers. "We've still got work to do," she said softly, "but I think we're on the right path." Melanie nodded, her grip tightening slightly. "Yeah, one step at a time." And as the night enveloped them in its quiet embrace, they felt a shared sense of hope, a belief that change, no matter how difficult, was always worth fighting for. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that make you think. Watch other videos to find inspiration and interesting stories. Share this video with your friends to make more people aware of important topics.